Closing out week 3, we're talking about the covenants, and the issue for our discussion board was the so-called New Covenant, as we discussed. We saw that the internalization of the covenant that is envisioned in Jeremiah is not a new concept, that it is something that was present from the onset of the so-called Old Covenant. We saw in Deuteronomy 6, this law is to be on your heart. So the issue then is what makes this different. Well, as you guys pointed out in that thread, the biggest difference was who's doing the writing, whereas the people had the responsibility to put, or at least the responsibility was not explicitly stated who was doing it. It was to be on your heart, so the implication is from Deuteronomy, the people were putting it there. The idea was in the New Covenant that God himself would write it on our hearts, and this suggests, as we see with the New Testament, it becomes more explicit, the Holy Spirit, a work of God in changing us, making us capable of maintaining covenantal responsibility and obligations. And this reveals something about the nature of the covenant that is not that is often misunderstood. A lot of times people tend to think of the Old Testament covenant as an external thing, that it was based on keeping a bunch of rules, and then there was no grace or anything like that. Well, that couldn't actually be further from the truth. And this is something Paul, when he is correcting his readers, he points to the Old Testament and says this isn't the way it worked. The idea is that the people were saved in the Exodus event, and that was their act. That was God calling them, bringing them out, saving them, and setting them up as his people, and setting up a covenant in which they had a certain responsibility, and that responsibility was to essentially, as Jesus put it, if you love me, keep my commandments. Their responsibility was to keep the commandments of God, to obey. In Deuteronomy 6, that's what we see with the Shema, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, or Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. And the implied meaning of hear is hear and obey, do this. And the law, you will love the Lord your God with all of your, and in the Hebrew, all of your heart, all of your inside, all your emotions and will, your whole self, and then everything else. It's an inside-out love of God that is supposed to characterize even the Old Covenant. But as part of that, they are to have the law in their hearts. That means this law was to make up who they were. They were people who were obedient to Yahweh's expectations and this covenantal faithfulness. When we get to the New Testament, the sense isn't that everything's changed. They still have this responsibility to obey. I mean, Jesus does say, if you love me, obey. James brings up, you have faith, but faith without works is dead. So there's still this, we have an obligation if we love Yahweh, if we love Jesus, if we're followers of Jesus, we still have to obey what he commands us to do, and that means be obedient children. The way that that's done is by internalizing the covenant. That is a personal, inside-out change and expression of that obedience. That's no different than what the Old Covenant was expecting of the people. The only difference is Yahweh himself, the Holy Spirit, has changed us and written the law on our hearts. So it changes, so we fundamentally change so that the law is on our hearts, and so that becomes a part of who we are as individuals. And then, of course, who we are as the church. So that's what's going on. It's not a brand new covenant in the sense that everything going completely new. It's a new covenant in how it is enacted and how who does the writing. Everything else is essentially, as far as the type of covenant, the type of expectations are the same. Now, certainly the sacrifices are different because Christ has once and for all taken care of the sacrifices. But we still have this obligation to love our neighbor as ourselves, as Leviticus says, and to love God with all our hearts, mind, and soul, as Deuteronomy says. So, and Jesus says all of the law and prophets are summed up in these two commands, and he by no means does away with them. He has just made us so that we can love our neighbor as ourselves and love God. And that kind of goes into the second part of not what we discussed, but what we were studying this week, and that is the nature of, at least the social justice, so-called nature of the covenants. We read Hosea and Amos especially, but we're going to see this as we go. We saw it in Isaiah, we're going to see it in Jeremiah, or we already saw it in Jeremiah, sorry. We're going to see it in the prophets that we studied this week. This idea that you as a covenant people, we as a covenant people, we're in the new, but there's this responsibility to do justice and righteousness. That is to love God. This is the vertical aspect of that covenant responsibility, and then to love others, love our neighbors, ourselves. The prophets constantly are rebuking the nation of Israel, and then after 722, when they're gone, Judah too, saying you are not you think you're worshiping Yahweh, but you're treating your neighbor like this. You're not doing justice, and that means you're not keeping the covenant. Yahweh expects that from his people. And so when we read the prophets are trying to change behavior and change attitude among their audience, and that is a big part of that, this idea of you have to love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a big part of what we see with Hosea.